One ring to rule them all, one ring to find them, one ring to bring them all, in the darkness bind them. 3 rings for the elven kings under the sky, 7 for the dwarf lords in their halls of stone, 9 for mortal men doomed to die, 1 for the dark lord on his dark throne in the land of Mordor where the shadows lie. 1 ring to rule them all, 1 ring to find them, 1 ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them in the land of Mordor where the shadows lie.
(1892), a year of bursting technology.
The first words I spoke in the original phonograph.
Music. And for many, the beginning of starting a new life. But down in Bloemfontein, South Africa, something else, something big would happen. So it was there where our adventure begins. In a country far below the equator, there lived a child. A child that would inspire many people to come after him. A child who would grow to be a great scholar in English and an innovator in the world of fantasy. J.R.R. Tolkien, one of the great geniuses of fantasy literature, would be born on January 3rd, 1892, and live in South Africa for about 4 years before moving away to England with his mother and brother. John Ronald Reuel Tolkien, or Ronald as he was known by those closer to him, did not remember much of this time in Africa, though it may have inspired his later works. His mother, Mabel Suffield, decided for the family to leave South Africa and go back to the West Midlands where her family was from after the death of his father, Arthur Reuel Tolkien, in 1896. Later in 1914, tragedy struck. Tolkien's mother died on November 14th, leaving her 2 boys to be raised with the parish priest who had often been with the family, Father Francis. Eventually, Tolkien was sent to live in a boarding home. Young Tolkien was infatuated with language, of which he had learned Greek, Latin, and others such as Finnish and Gothic. For fun, he would even create his own languages. Tolkien had been attending King Edward's for his schooling and had made friends whom he had met within a club they called the TCBS, or otherwise known as Tea Club and Barovian Society. They would converse with one another and share about each other's literature and critique it together. Tolkien developed his abilities in literature and language, and later in 1911 he attended Exeter College, University of Oxford, to continue his education in these fields, especially in Germanic language. In 1913, Tolkien returned to a previous relationship he had with a woman named Edith Bratt, and by doing so he received a second-class degree in honor moderations. He only completed 2 out of the 4 required years of his Oxford course due to this. He then changed his course at Oxford. While at Oxford, he studied the poem Christ of Cynewulf, which further inspired him to create his own world in literature. Tolkien completed his courses and gained a first-class degree in 1915. During this time, he had developed many poems, as well as developed a language he called Kenya, which was later used in his future writings as the language of certain elves of Middle-earth. Approximately a year before Tolkien had graduated from Oxford, World War I had struck. Europe was ablaze with war, and Tolkien was one of many others that enlisted to join the war. He joined and eventually became a lieutenant, but before leaving for France to fight in the Somme offensive, he married Edith in March of 1926. World War I left a lasting impact on Tolkien. Tolkien spent 4 months fighting in trenches and eventually contracted a disease called trench fever. He was sent back to England to recover. Most of his friends from the TCBS were killed during the war. Tolkien himself wrote and compiled stories he had to help him recover from the war. The fighting was something he never forgot, and his experience in the trenches as well as others were inspiration for themes, ideas, and places in The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit.
After the war, Tolkien was able to obtain academic positions at places such as the University of Leeds and Oxford. While at Oxford, Tolkien didn't do much writing. He wrote some scholarly essays, which did become relatively popular and influential, such as Beowulf, The Monsters and the Critics. He also formed a close circle of friends at Oxford, known as the Inklings, which include none other than C.S. Lewis, writer of the Chronicles of Narnia. Tolkien and Lewis were close friends. The two even critiqued some of each other's writings.
Tolkien told plenty of stories to his 4 children, many of which he compiled into books, but the inspiration behind The Hobbit is quite peculiar. One day, at Oxford, Tolkien was doing some work when he decided to write the sentence, "In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit," on a piece of paper. What is a hobbit? Not even he knew the answer to this, but he decided to run with the idea. The single sentence grew into the longer work, The Hobbit, which he wrote and published through George Allen and Unwin in 1937. While working on it, he would share bits and pieces of it with his children and get their opinions on the story so he could better edit the work. The book was very well received by the public and has grown to be one of the most well-known and loved fantasy books of all time.
He then decided to continue the story into what is now known as The Lord of the Rings. He wrote the book to be one large story, but when the publisher saw what Tolkien had to offer, they at first refused to publish it. After a while, though, they finally agreed to publish it, but in 3 parts: The Fellowship of the Ring, The Two Towers, and The Return of the King, mainly for the publisher to not lose as much money if the book was not that successful. The Lord of the Rings was published in 1954 and 1955, and was very successful. This was a major triumph for Tolkien.
Time passed by and his works, mainly The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, grew more famous. People would even come to see his house or call him and ask him questions. He grew annoyed with this and took several measures so he could live in peace. Tolkien retired in 1959 and moved to Bournemouth with his wife. In 1971, Edith Tolkien died, and 2 years later, on September 2nd, 1973, was followed by her husband. They were buried together in a cemetery in Oxford. The long-lasting impact of Tolkien's works is still very prominent today. The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit have had their own movies produced and directed by Peter Jackson. Many video games have been made based on the books or the movies. The popular game Dungeons & Dragons has had some influence from the fantasy of these books. The poems from the books have been put to music, and other songs by popular artists and bands are inspired by this literature. More recently, after the Cassini-Huygens spacecraft flew by Saturn's moon, Titan, and took pictures of the surface, NASA named many of the geographical formations after characters and locations in the Middle Earth from Tolkien's writings.
Far over the misty mountains cold, to dungeons deep and caverns old.
Tolkien's Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit have been recently added to a list of many other books which are deemed banned or inappropriate. Many Christian groups are against the books, saying they contain unchristian themes or just unchristian in general, even though Tolkien himself was a devout Catholic and even confirmed that The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings were Christian literature with Christian themes. He even had some help from his good friend C.S. Lewis when writing the books. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia is highly respected amongst Christian societies because of its blatantly obvious Christian themes. On the release of The Fellowship of the Ring, Lewis even praised the book in a review he made for it. Tolkien's books are becoming banned books like many others just because of the fantasy they tell. This ingenious author, who knew a lot about language, literature, and fantasy, developed many great works. They are very popular and are considered some of the best fantasy books of all time. They serve as examples to other authors writing similar material. The works are heavily inspired by the times he lived in and the tragedies and triumphs he experienced. The tragedy of his death hindered the publishing of many of his other works on Middle-earth, but the long-standing triumph of the books in society and their impact will last forever. His works are fantasy masterpieces and will forever be remembered
And inspire many other fantasy authors, artists, and people to come.
J.R.R. Tolkien is truly one author, and his life is one story to rule them all.